So again, I bring you welcome and greeting from the Center for Reconciliation. I'm delighted that tonight in our panel, where we are talking about what it might look like to move from being a divinity school that has a Center for Reconciliation to becoming an institution, a divinity school that is a Center for Reconciliation. That we've invited some different guests to join us in this conversation. I'll be moderating and facilitating the conversation tonight, but I'd like to briefly introduce each of my colleagues who will be giving their perspectives and their insights from the places that they work and sit at the Divinity School. So I'm going to begin with Dr. Jung Choi. Dr. Choi is a scholar teacher trained in the New Testament and early Christianity. Before coming to Duke Divinity School, Dr. Choi was an assistant professor of religious studies at North Carolina Wesleyan College in Rocky Mount, North Carolina. She joined the Duke Divinity School faculty this academic year, and like many at DDS, wears multiple hats. But tonight she is here in her role as the co-director of the newly formed Asian House of Studies. Dr. Choi is committed to expanding access to theological education, and she has worked enthusiastically with diverse groups of students and colleagues. Although I have not yet been able to meet Dr. Choi in person, I have had a few opportunities to interact with her this academic year and have appreciated her collaborative spirit. I also really appreciated her work earlier this spring as she and others in the Asian House of Studies created space for the Divinity School to grow an understanding of and to begin to respond to with better clarity the increased visibility of violence and discrimination against Asians and those of Asian descent in the United States context. We are really grateful for your presence with us at the Divinity School and in this conversation tonight. Our next guest, Dr. David Emmanuel Goatley, is a constructive theologian whose scholarship and practices are at the intersection of missiology, Black theology, and leadership strategy. A global missiologist, he emphasizes cross-cultural experiential learning with Indigenous communities to deepen understanding, broaden horizons, and strengthen Christian discipleship and leadership formation. He also wears many hats at the Divinity School and is with us tonight primarily from the location of being director of the Office of Black Church Studies. In the 3 years or so that Dr. Goatley has been part of the Divinity School, I have personally appreciated his leadership and his collaborative spirit, and his work on helping the Divinity School look seriously at what we need to do to dismantle systems of racism within our institution and within our world. To me, he is an example of someone who has a non-anxious presence, who can get clearly to the heart of a sticky issue in a way that furthers conversation rather than stifling it. Welcome to you this evening. And our third panelist, Alma Tinoco Ruiz, is a lecturer in homiletics and evangelism. She is the current director of the Hispanic House of Studies at Duke Divinity School and is also working on completing her PhD degree here. A gifted scholar, Professor Ruiz is a practical theologian whose work centers on the intersections of homiletics, pastoral care, and evangelism. In her first year as the director of the Hispanic House, she has found new ways to collaborate and innovate to support the concerns of Latinx students and faculty, despite the challenges of finishing her dissertation and taking on a new role in the midst of the pandemic. Thank you so much for joining us in this roundtable conversation tonight. Bienvenidos. So I'd like to spend just a few moments framing some of what the CFR perspective is and what our conversation is about tonight. At the Center for Reconciliation, we do believe that all Christians are called into the ministry of reconciliation. But we also know that that language is problematic for many, and that as Christians, we often fall short of our goal. Our work, however, is to seek to support robust reflection on what a ministry of reconciliation means theologically and practically, and how to blend and enact those tools, theological and practical tools, in ways that are helpful in forming Christ-like individuals, churches, congregations, and institutions. The CFR is not the only center, initiative, office, or program at the Divinity School that works seriously for justice, for transformation, and for theologically grounded practice. In fact, the Center for Reconciliation often finds ourselves, with our very small staff, in the position of needing to partner with others. We also know that we do this not just because we have a small staff, but because the work is large and varied, and that the needs of the world are many, and that we cannot do it all on our own. So tonight we're hoping to have some opportunity to discuss and explore the work that we do in our own departments, and also the work that we do collectively, and to dream together a little bit about what it would mean to shift our Divinity School from a school that has a Center for Reconciliation to a new narrative where we think about how we all are a Center for Reconciliation. And so with that, I would like to take some time. I've asked each of our three panelists if they will share briefly about the work of their initiative or program, and to help those of us, I know many on the call are familiar with Duke Divinity School, but we also have guests who may not be as familiar. So I'm going to let them all in turn have an opportunity to share from their perspective. Jung, would you mind if we begin with you?
Not at all. Hello, everyone. Once again, I'm Choi. I'm a co-director of Asian House of Study, which is a brand new house of study, which we have just started in January. We are aiming at amplify the voices of Asian and an Asian descent, and what we sometimes call as AAPI, Asian and Asian American and Pacific Islanders, in the Duke Divinity community and the church bodies and academia. And then we are also connecting AAPI students and an alumni and a faculty and staff and church leaders and the Duke Divinity School and beyond. And we are also working, collaborating together with the OBCS and the Hispanic House of Studies and CFR, and then many other the houses of studies and the missions and the ministries at Divinity School and beyond. We are also engaging critically with the theological questions and also dismantling racism along with many others, and bringing in justice and transformation. And these important questions and themes. And then we are serving AIPI students and a faculty and an alumni and a staff. And then you can see that AAPI is such a wide array of group, which is also our challenge, because we have diverse and very distinct traditions and narratives. So it is really hard to, and even impossible, and it's damaging to flatten our diverse stories into just one group, which is we are trying to dismantle as well, because our diverse voices, our stories of struggle and war and pain, and then also love and joy and reconciliation, and how we can come to love God and love one another, are so distinct. And it's common, but also distinct. So we are trying to concern these diversities, and also trying to strike the, create unity, not uniformity.
Thank you. I appreciate that image of unity rather than uniformity. I'm going to hold on to that one. Alma, please share from your perspective.
So greetings, everyone. It's a blessing to be here with all of you. The Hispanic House Study was created as a resource center for students, pastors, and congregations in order to support their efforts to do ministry with the Hispanic Latinx community in the US. We have been trying to equip and accompany church leaders and congregations of all backgrounds and traditions on their journey to becoming the church Christ has called us to be, a place of unity, transformation, restoration, and holistic healing. For this purpose, we offer different programs and opportunities for theological and ministerial formation. One of these is a certificate in Latinx studies. Through the certificate, we seek to contribute to the formation of students' souls, minds, and bodies as they join the weekly Caminantes spiritual formation gatherings, and as they take courses that will help them grow in their knowledge of the faith, theology, experience, and God-given gifts of the Hispanic Latinx community and other communities of color. We hope that these brand new certificates and the accompaniment that the students will receive from the Hispanic House and the Latinx professors will equip them and inspire them to serve in diverse contexts as they continue their journey of ministry. Another program that we have and that we are very proud of is the Hispanic Latinx Preaching Initiative. This initiative provides an opportunity for Hispanic Latinx pastors, lay leaders, and congregants to receive theological and ministerial training in Spanish. So it's a great opportunity to be in community with Hispanic Latinx leaders here in North Carolina and from different, now that we are offering everything online. So we have students from different states and even from outside the US. So one of the prompts that Valerie gave us was a question of the challenges that we face in our ministry, in our area and context. And so I would say that some of the challenges we face is that many pastors and church leaders are ill-equipped to effectively serve in diverse and polarized country as the US. Many of them are sent out, many of our students are sent out to the world to serve God and do ministry with people without equipping them to do ministry with diverse and polarized communities. So what happens in most cases is that pastors limit their scope of ministry to what they feel most comfortable doing, serving with the people they know best and where they will not be out of their comfort zone. The biggest challenge is when the leadership at the denominational level and seminary level doesn't understand the need to contribute in the formation of pastors and Christian leaders who will be culturally competent and culturally humble. So I believe, as Jung was saying, we are in a great opportunity to work together and to partner and to make sure that the students who leave Duke Divinity are equipped to serve in diverse contexts.
Thank you for those comments and for helping us understand your context, but also bringing forward this shared, I would say, point that we have that we need to equip our pastors, our student pastors, to be able to serve in these diverse settings. David, if you would share a bit about this question from where you sit, what you have to share about the Office of Black Church Studies and what you see.
I want to first say thanks for the invitation to be a part of this conversation tonight, and grateful to be able to be here with our colleagues, and thankful for the rich contributions that each of them make personally and through their units. The Office of Black Church Studies was, our roots go back to 1972. So next year, we celebrate our golden anniversary, or our 50th year of being a part of the Duke Divinity School. The Office of Black Church Studies is responsible for contributing to teaching and scholarship and service, as we are describing it now, from the Black church for the whole church. We describe it that way because Black church studies, we do not see as a cul-de-sac, but as a thoroughfare to the intellectual project of the university and the theological project of the Divinity School. I'll describe the kind of work we do in three ways. First, we have a curricular oversight responsibility. One of the distinguishing factors or characteristics of Duke Divinity School is that all students who earn the Master of Divinity degree are required to take at least one course in Black Church Studies. I think that this is a commendable decision that goes back several years to emphasizing that race is an integral part of the American experience. And anyone who functions in the United States of America is functioning explicitly or implicitly in relationship to the racial heritage and the racist heritage that has contributed to genocide and slavery and exploitation. And so if you're going to do good and faithful pastoral ministry or theological education in the United States context, one needs to minimally have some exposure to the intellectual and spiritual contributions from the Black church to help to inform the work. So in addition to courses that are offered are related to that, we also are happy to offer a certificate in Black Church Studies. And the trajectory of our certificate from the beginning has had multicultural participation. So we rejoice that we have people who are Black students, but not exclusively Black students, who are earning the certificate in Black Church Studies, and they find that it adds value to their spiritual, their theological, and their vocational work. We also launched in 2019 a multi-year project called the Black Pastoral Leadership Collaboration. This has 4 components. One is a multi-year, multidisciplinary research project around leadership lessons that are gleaned from different eras from the Black church. We also are participating in an archiving project with seminal leaders of the intellectual projects to facilitate scholarship. And additionally, we are doing a annual school around methodologies for ministry that include contextualization, conscientization, and construction. We also do lectures and collaborations, and we rejoice to have been able to do collaborations with the Center for Reconciliation and with the Hispanic House of Studies, and look forward to working closely with the Asian House of Studies. Finally, we play a role of connecting students and faculty to various community entities. For example, we'll be working with a couple of partners to do a 3-session webinar around positive mental health for pastors and pastoral leaders. All of us have gone through over a year of a great intensity of stress and distress and dislocation, and pastors and ministry leaders need to attend not only to the care of their communities and the larger context, but also attend to their own self-care and their positive mental health so that they can do good and faithful service. One of the challenges that we face is that in the United States, we always contend with either overt or covert racism. And by racism, I mean the kind of ideology that assumes the inherent superiority of people who identify as white and the inherent and assumed inferiority of anyone else who is not. And that we always have to contend with overtly and covertly, whether it's on the campus or in the community. Thanks.
So thank you to each of you for elaborating a little bit more about your particular center that you're coming to the conversation from. For the audience, there are notes of resonance between each of the centers, the work that they're trying to do, and yet there are differences. And I am reminded that each of you said in different ways that we are dealing with issues of injustice, we're dealing with issues of racism, we're dealing with issues of discrimination. And yet, as Jung reminded us, we're not monolithic either. And so whether you're coming from the Asian House of Studies or the Hispanic House of Studies or the Office of Black Church Studies, there are nuances and a wealth of richness within each of those units as well. And so I thank you for helping to elaborate a little bit on some of that and some of what your challenges are. I do have a few, just a word of process to everyone. I have a few directed questions that I have asked my panelists to be prepared to respond to. And then we will have some time for those of you who are participating in the audience with us to be able to ask questions to the panel. So I hope that you are thinking about things that you would like to ask as well. As we think about what the Center for Reconciliation has done and hopes to continue to do work in partnership with each of your different departments, as we think about the space that we find ourselves in at the Divinity School, what do you find to be some of the limitations or obstacles, maybe some things that you named briefly in your previous comments or something that you didn't surface, to thinking about working with your students and your constituents with the word and framing of reconciliation? What are the challenges and obstacles that there might be to the idea of reconciliation? And I'll let this be kind of a little bit popcorn instead of calling on you individually. So feel free to unmute yourself as you have something to say.
I can go first. I don't think we can ever be completely prepared to talk about reconciliation. For instance, for some years, I was hesitant to use the word reconciliation in my preaching and teaching, because in my ministry as pastor and teacher with women from different countries in Latin America, I have learned that the word reconciliation has been used many times to oppress the least of this in this context, the women and children. Culturally, we have been taught that family is family, and it doesn't matter how much your family hurt you, you should always seek reconciliation. In the Christian tradition, we have been taught that no matter how much others hurt you, you should always seek to reconcile, especially if they belong to the family of Christ. Because of this, many people, especially women and children who have experienced emotional, physical, and or sexual abuse, had been obligated to remain silent and even to live close to and have some kind of relationship with the perpetrator, with the abuser. So reconciliation in these cases usually means forgiving, forgetting, and having a friendly relationship with the one or ones who hurt you. It means to repair relationships that are broken. But if we were honest, we would admit that in some cases there are relationships that cannot be repaired. In these cases, reconciliation might mean you take your way and I take mine for our own safety. And from my point of view, being able to terminate with a hurtful relationship also means reconciliation. It's the ending of suffering and oppression. Pastor and psychologist Randall Nichols helped me understand that there are other more realistic and honest ways of preaching and teaching about the concept of reconciliation. He says in his book, The Restoring Word, Preaching as Pastoral Communication, that, and I'll quote from that, reconciliation too often carries with it the connotation of the peaceful, happy ending. And life does not always work out that way, nor should it. With clarifying and restructuring, we achieve a more realistic, honest, and open way of being in relationship. Even when that may mean non-specific outcomes such as agreeing to disagree, or severing a living arrangement, or facing the impossibility of making someone different, or taking a firmly oppositional stand to something or someone. Nichols says that those things too should be called reconciliation. And that the key thing is learning not to fool ourselves or operate on false assumptions. So I think that one of the challenges we face when we teach or preach about reconciliation is that we try to make it this happy ending. And reconciliation doesn't always mean that. We need to understand the situation first and what it implies. And for people who experience, for some people and in some cases, to experience restoration and healing, need to take separate ways from those who had abused them. And so I think we need to be very honest and stop fooling ourselves, trying to make this something easy and something that works the same way for everyone. And we need to learn to listen, to really listen to people and the circumstances, and not be so quick to ask people to reconcile or to even obligate people to reconcile in the case of some oppressive Christian traditions.
I appreciate Alma's talking about the difficulty of reconciliation, because there are some for whom they like to use the language of reconciliation and it sounds nice. But I'd like to note the work of the theologian J. Diotis Roberts, whose seminal text 50 years ago in 1971 was entitled Liberation and Reconciliation. And part of his argument is that you can't be reconciled and you can't do the work of reconciliation independent of the work of liberation. You cannot assume that people are going to be bound and be reconciled, because reconciliation requires a certain amount of agency to be able to exercise. And so part of his approach was, it was contested by some who said they didn't like the idea of him holding liberation and reconciliation in tension and in tandem. There are some who would argue that reconciliation comes after liberation, so that it's sequential. But Roberts asserted that implies that if you're going to wait until full liberation to do the work of reconciliation, then you've abandoned the work of reconciliation. You can't do it, but that it's always a work in progress. And the first step is a step toward liberation. So you can't lead with reconciliation. You have to lead with liberation, and that it's messy and it's entangled and it's knotted together, and it requires and of course, and he was writing in the Black-white binary, coming out of the Black Power movement. And so part of what his argument is that there's some work white folks have to do interior to white folks. And there's some work that Black folks have to do with Black folks. And then there's some work they had to do together. And so, of course, drawing it forward with more of a multicultural reality in which we live in the United States and connected globally. The principles, I think, hold that it's a non-starter to try to talk about reconciliation from a place of power and a place of privilege, where you're going to impose the conditions that reconciliation has to come as a second step to the work of liberation, so that people can be free and respected and have the opportunity to exercise their agency, to have the chance to say yes and the choice to say no. And if you don't have them both, then you can't be reconciled. So the work of reconciliation is important. And Roberts also argued that the weight and the burden of reconciliation, that's the cost of the cross, that it's heavy and it's messy and it's costly. And if you're gonna be reconciled, you have to give up your power. So it's in tension, it's in tandem, and it's difficult work that we will be in process doing. But liberation is the first step, and reconciliation is a following step.
I really appreciate these conversations. These conversations resonate so well with what I have been thinking about and what our House of Study has been thinking about as well. And it's definitely, well, as Asian, we see that this danger of a single story are operating, and which is so damaging. And we see that this seeming silence of Asian and Asian American and then AAPI people's theological voices. I say seeming silence because we, the people, have never been silent, but our voices have not been heard. And because of this seeming silence that was now generating this single stories, like the model minority myth, which was used as a wedge to pit among people of God, and which has been always the ways in which the power, the status quo, and the empire have been using to divide and conquer. So it is really important for us, all of us, and especially the Divinity School students, to learn more about these complex stories and the histories of AAPI, the theologies and history, especially when the public school in the US does not teach enough Asian American histories. To know about these histories and these complexities so that we can avoid this dangerous single story, single trope that are damaging for all of us all. So my question and our questions have always been that when our own narratives, we have distinct narratives, and our narratives of my God and God of my people, are they necessarily competing with other people's narratives of your God and God of their people? It is really messy, but it's really important for us to remember and get together and try to work with how our narratives of my God and God of my people are actually our God, and we are all. But going there, it really takes time, and we need to think about what is our common goal, which is liberation. And then we can go to the reconciliation. And so we can think about that, how our stories of struggle and faith are validated, not at the expense of other stories of faith and struggles. It is really important for us to work together, how our stories are maybe distinct, maybe different, but we need to work with it together so that we can have reconciliation.
Thank you, each of you, for what is already a rich conversation. Alma, if you could please, I did have a request that you would repeat the book title and author that you named. And I do have the title and the J.D. Otis Roberts book, so I'm going to try to collect these and send them out to people who attended afterwards. But if you maybe could private message me later, Alma, maybe that would be the way, and I'll make sure everybody gets it.
I can send it to you, James. That would be
Great.
better.
Thank you. So let's move on to our next question. We've spent a little bit of time thinking about some of the challenges, talking about the idea that reconciliation is difficult, hard, and messy. Sometimes the world or even our churches might be asking us to do a quick process where we forgive and forget and we gloss over and sweep things under the rug. And that is certainly not the Center for Reconciliation's understanding of what the ministry of reconciliation is about. And so I thank you for the ways that you have illuminated some of the challenges and obstacles that we find and the complexity that there is in talking about what do we even mean, what are we working for, because it touches on so many kinds of things. Our different narratives and stories, as Jung was pointing out, but also the binaries that we've put up and perpetuated on each other. And as a white person, often coming from the place of power, but not only that, and that we all have work to do in a number of fronts, and that there are all kinds of racial things that we've constructed that we now have to unconstruct, deconstruct, but we also have things that are maybe different kinds of harm. So gender discrimination, I appreciate Alma's starting with a place of women and children and harm that is done, violence. And I will name that violence is not only done to women. Men are also victims of domestic things. And so, there are interfamily things that the church often maybe we haven't equipped our leaders to be able to deal with this. But this is part of what we're doing together collaboratively, and not just us, other centers and initiatives here at the Divinity School working on some of these issues. So thank you for your thoughts on that. I do want to move us a little bit to thinking about where we might see signs of hope, because there are always so many places that we can look at the things that are wrong. And I think that's important. We have to be able to clearly name the problems that we see so that we can move forward on addressing them. But we don't want to get stuck in our laments. So where do you see signs of hope, of progress at the Divinity School? Where are we collectively getting some things right? How are we moving in ways that are positive to become a more Christ-like institution? There may be places that we still have work to do, but do you have any concrete examples of things that at least are signposts that we're on the right road? So that's my next question to you, is where do you see signs of hope?
You're talking about hope in the Divinity School?
Yes, to be clear, we are trying to center this around what's happening at the Divinity School, but you can go broader than that if that's what's on your heart as well. I don't want to limit where the Spirit is leading you.
No, I want to answer the question that's asked. I think for me, some glimmer of hope has to do with members of faculty and staff in the last 2 years. So I think last year, when we talk about faculty and staff, I think 50% or more of new faculty and staff who joined us last year were non-white. I think that is a glimmer of hope. With faculty appointments last year, I think there were perhaps 2 Latinx, 3 or 4 Black faculty, a couple of white faculty. So that in the teaching and faculty, there was some progress. Just this spring, we announced that this fall, there will be 3 new faculty joining us. One is Asian heritage, one is Latinx, one is white. So I think that those are some hints of progress. We still have more work to do because we are a theological institution embedded in a Research One institution in the United States. And so there is a default to a Eurocentric norm in terms of what is presumed to be first-rate scholarship, what is presumed to be thought leadership, what is presumed to be the kind of texts around which courses are built. So we still have some work to do on diversifying, and that diversifying needs to be done in the intellectual projects and not delegated to or outsourced to those of us who are not white and male. But I do think that we're moving the needle. We've had a couple of good years, and we look forward to that. We also celebrate the coming dean, who is Puerto Rican by birth, who will be the dean of the school. That's a good sign. So I think those are indications that we are populating the Divinity School with people who can contribute to helping us as an institution to be reconciled to God. God was in Christ reconciling the world to God's self. And we've been given that ministry of reconciliation. So I think we are growing with more people who will have a vision for a real and robust kind of reconciliation that calls for honesty and integrity and hard work.
I would also say that the passionate people in the Divinity School who are willing to say, let's dream together. That's exactly what you said, Alma, to me. And then David and Edgardo and Dean Jones and leaderships and the faculties and the staff and students, they have been sharing this vision together and saying, let's work. That's hard work, but it's daunting. It's daunting work, but it's necessary work, and we will work together. So this passion, these kind of supports are such a glimmer of hope. And then we are ready to work together. It will be really lots of work, but we are ready and we are committed. And also the glimmer of hope is, for me, is that we are praying community, that prayer and actions are not disconnected. It's jointed. And the people at Divinity School, Duke Divinity School, we are willing to be vulnerable in our prayers in front of God, and prayers with one another. Prayers are naturally makes us vulnerable. And in our vulnerability, we grow. And then also we see the pain among us, and we see the trauma, the layers of trauma. But to get to those trauma to be healed, we need to be vulnerable, and we need to be honest with one another and not looking for easy answer, but work together and also realize our own complicity in these, and repent and stand up and have a solidarity and work together.
Well, I don't have much to add to that, but I would say that having this conversation, I think, is a sign of hope. It's a sign of hope for me, being able to have this kind of conversations, honest conversations about reconciliation, and to be able to talk about racism openly. I think that's really good. And as Jung said, we have been in conversations and talking. We all care a lot about our students, and we all want to be a better place, and really form students and pastors who will be out there and who will be instruments of reconciliation and will teach against racism in their churches too. And so the students also give me hope, because the students will not let us sit back and relax. They keep reminding us that we are not doing enough and that we should do more. And that's good. That's good. I mean, that gives me hope, because I know that even if we relax and sit back, we'll receive a letter from the students and pointing us where we are not doing enough and the areas in which we should do a better job. And so I'm thankful for that. And reading the applications of incoming students, I'm like excited to have them with us, and also think that they will help us move forward and grow. as an institution that understands and is against all kinds of oppression and racism.
Great, thank you all for responding to that question, and I appreciate your signs of hope that you've named. And Alma, you are exactly right. The students will definitely not let us sit back and rest on our accomplishments, but always be pushing us forward, and that is a gift. So thank you for naming that one as well. I have one more question, and I am starting to get some other questions that from our observers and listeners. But the last question that I had asked our three panelists to consider and think about was maybe a bit of an imagination, vision casting kind of a question. In your view, and maybe this is also a question of, yeah, so in your view, how does the Divinity School transition from being a school that has a Center for Reconciliation to being a school that is a Center for Reconciliation? As I'm saying it out loud now, I'm thinking maybe the question is, should we be going that way? But I think so. But I welcome your comments on what would that look like? How do we get there? If that is a vision that we share, what additional steps do we need to take, and how do we build towards that future?
I can go first. For Duke Divinity School to become a Center for Reconciliation, I believe Duke Divinity School must first understand and acknowledge two things. First, that experiencing reconciliation, as we usually understand it, will not always be possible. And second, that to be able to experience reconciliation, we need to be honest and acknowledge Duke University's and Duke Divinity's complicity in the history of racism and oppression in the US. In order to experience any kind of healing or restoration, we need to first acknowledge the historical trauma that Duke University and Duke Divinity have inflicted on people of color, especially on Native Americans and Black people. For instance, I know some people believe that we should forget about the past and move toward the future. However, for people who have experienced traumatic wounds, in this case, traumatic wounds inflicted by racism and oppression, cannot move forward if they have not experienced healing, or at least started their healing journey. And I will quote someone who I read this book recently, and I fell in love with his writing. And the title of the book is Healing the Soul Wound, Trauma-Informed Counseling for Indigenous Communities, by psychologist researcher Eduardo Duran. In this book, Duran shares that Native Americans' idea of historical and intergenerational trauma involves the understanding that trauma occurs in the soul or spirit. Therefore, Duran refers to historical and intergenerational trauma as soul wound. For Native Americans, historical and intergenerational trauma is not just a wound of the mind and the body, but above all, it is a wound of the soul. For this reason, addressing the traumatic injuries individuals and communities have experienced is essential not only for their well-being, but also for their descendants' well-being. Duran emphasizes the danger of untreated trauma. He affirms that research literature on intergenerational post-traumatic stress shows that when trauma is not dealt with in previous generations, it has to be dealt with in subsequent generations. Furthermore, not only is the trauma passed on intergenerationally, but it is cumulative. Therefore, unresolved trauma becomes more severe each time it is passed on to subsequent generations. We are dealing in Duke Divinity School and in the whole nation with cumulative, collective historical trauma. We are dealing with soul wounds that were not effectively treated before, and consequently are deeper now. And we cannot continue pretending that treating them with an ointment and a bandage will heal them. So to be able to heal, to really heal these wounds, we need to have these difficult conversations about the past and the present.
Thank you, Alma. This reminds me of, I think it was James Gilligan who said, trauma that is not transformed is transferred. Thank you.
I would say to your question, Valerie, one of your version of question that should Duke Divinity School be the center for the reconciliation? I would say, of course, yes, resounding yes, we should. Now the time is ripe, and we are in the time that we cannot go back. In terms of the Asian experiences and an Asian American and an Asian descent experience, last year had shown us that the anti-Asian racism is laying bare this deep-rooted racism, which is literally killing people, which has been always there, but last year was really amplifying those stories and what has been happening. This is really important time for us Christians to learn from one another and to form a coalition of love and trying to work together once again how our narratives are validated, not the expense of one another, and how we can form solidarity and a coalition of love so that we can go to reconciliation. All these requires us to work together and teach our students, and teach ourselves and educate ourselves so that we equip the pastors who will be serving various congregations with the capacity and then of course the faith that can serve all the people of God.
I think that if Duke Divinity School is going to be a center of reconciliation, there are at least a couple of things that we would have to attend to and take very seriously. One is we have to pay attention to the intellectual project of the Divinity School. And so those of us who teach theology classes try to help people to move, especially in the introductory ones, to help people move from their embedded theology to deliberative theology. Stone and Duke have a primer talk about how to think theologically, and that's the approach that they take. That we have things that we just believe. We don't know why we believe them. We don't know where they came from. It's just we've always known it, and it's the embedded stuff. Jesus loves me. This I know because the Bible tells me so. Yeah, that's true, but that's not enough. when, people are victims of human trafficking. We have to do more than that. And so we have to help people move from embedded to deliberative theology. But sometimes, even those of us who, have gone through our graduate theological education and, done what we need to do to earn the credentials to be considered for faculty positions, the sources of our theological wisdom are still the embedded sources. And we haven't done the deliberative work about diversifying the canons that we draw upon. It's very homogeneous. And so the intellectual project needs to be more inclusive of different voices that come from different locations and different experiences. If we are going to be a center of reconciliation, because we have to take very seriously the intellectual project. And if we're going to be a center of reconciliation, then we have to expand the canon that we draw on for the intellectual project. Second, we have to be challenged in what I would call an incarnational project. Durham is a complicated and hurt place. And as Alma was talking about, there is trauma that is multi-generational, and it hadn't been treated. And so one of the invitations would be, how do we engage communities and congregations in communities to help them to do their work of liberation and reconciliation? How do we have a more outward disposition? We do good work that is outward facing, but there's always more that there's a possibility to do. So it's like inhaling and exhaling. How do we have outward facing work? How do we have inward facing work? How do we create more opportunities for people in communities to engage with the life of the campus? How do we create more opportunities for good engagement with authenticity and integrity for those of us who spend a lot of time on campus in communities where there is pain and where there are tears and where there's brokenness? So I think that we can be, if we pay more attention to the intellectual project of the school and the incarnational project of the school.
Thank you for your thoughts. It reminds me that this work, as I said at the beginning, is vast and broad. It has many faces and facets, and it is not, as I think as David reminded us, it's messy work, and it's not work that we can do too quickly. So it takes time for us to engage in it. But I'm grateful for the time that you've given to the questions I brought. And we're going to move now to a period where I am going to open the chat so that people can post more publicly the questions that they have. But there have been some that came in while we've been talking that I will start with. One question that came in comes from one of our THD students, one of our CFR THD students, Jackson. And he's asking a question that takes off of some of what you were talking about early on, David, about the processes of reconciliation and liberation going together. And he asks if there are conditions in which reconciliation might precede liberation. For example, could reconciliation take the form of building transfigurative coalitions with the oppressor class for the liberation of all?
I do not have the kind of imagination to conceive of being reconciled to someone who is consciously oppressing me. I'm not saying it can't be done. God can do whatever God wants to do. I don't have the kind of imagination to conceive. Now, there are behaviors and there's ideology that some people have that is embedded and that they're not conscious of it. And if you can get to their consciousness to help them to interrogate some of the assumptions that are embedded in religious nationalism and white supremacy, and if you can pierce that, but I don't have the imagination to conceive of being reconciled to my oppressor. So if it can happen, I don't know how, but God can do whatever God wants to do.
Yeah, I appreciate that as a response, because I think too often we think there has to be a way, or there is a quick and easy answer. And I also have a colleague, I used to have posted, of course, my bulletin board at the office, I think it still is posted, but I have a quote from a board meeting that I was in when I used to work at Eastern Mennonite University in Harrisonburg, Virginia, at their Center for Justice and Peace building. Cheryl Talley was an African-American woman who was on our board. And the quote I have written to remind myself is, she said, "The oppressor always wants a relationship, and the oppressed would like liberation and justice. But the oppressor class is always seeking, for a way to build that relationship." So I remind myself that it's not that easy, and I appreciate you being honest about not being able to imagine that, and also acknowledging that God is a God of surprises, and maybe there is something beyond what the four of us are able to see, or this group is able to see.
Well,
So
Valerie, can I mention though that when you talked about the quote about oppressors want relationships, I think relationship is a generous word.
Mhm.
I'm not sure oppressors want relationship, because relationship has embedded in it mutuality and reciprocity.
Yeah,
At
right.
least as I understand relationship. They may want some kind of connection on their terms. But I don't know that oppressors want to be in a relationship that says that sometimes we have to have honest conversations and difficult conversations to be able to look somebody in the eye and say, you were wrong,
Yeah,
and you need to change. I don't know that an oppressor is willing to accept that from someone that they are marginalized. So I
right.
think I know what she was saying, but I think that's being generous to use the language of relationship of an oppressor.
Yeah, thank you. Another question that came in that is directed specifically to Alma and Jung. Someone notes that they've been reading a lot more complete and truthful histories of the Black American experience recently. And they're wondering if there are resources that you could recommend to help learn more about complete and truthful histories on Latinx or AIP histories within the United States. So if you have those titles, people would be interested. If you don't have anything, then this is clearly something we have to look for.
Yes. One of the books that I read recently that is not specifically on history, I have read homiletics and the history of African American preaching and all that. But one of the books that has been very helpful to me recently in terms of understanding the historical trauma that both oppressor and oppressed had inherited and have experienced is My Grandmother's Hands by Resma. I don't remember how to pronounce his last name. By My Grandmother's Hands. And it's very helpful. And reading that together with Eduardo Duran, for me, has been very meaningful because Duran also speaks to that reality. You know, that we usually understand the oppressor as just the oppressor and don't see the oppressor as a victim and as someone who also have soul wounds, who also have inherited historical trauma, and who also needs healing. And so those two books have been very helpful.
Thank you. Jung, do you have any titles to add for people's reading list?
There are so many books. So I was trying to think that I could say that there is a fascinating books. The title is Asian Americans in Dixie, Race and Migration in the South. That this is one of the books that I can recommend. There are lots of the compendiums, the edited volumes by AAPI, the scholars, and there are also feminist scholars, including me, and then they are bringing in these discussions. So, and then there is also the volume which will be coming up pretty soon about that how Asian descent people are reading about the scriptures. And then I really liked that David was talking about that we really need to expand our canon. That's exactly what we are trying to do, along with that the need of expanding our canon. So I can send actually the list of the books that I can think about, because there are too many, to the participants. And then Alma, I also want to hear from you more about the books that you could recommend, because there are also the larger volumes that the Latinx scholars and African American scholars and the Asian AAPI scholars are working together in the theme of justice and liberation. So these collaborative works are so important, and there are lots of volumes out there, and that they are being formed constantly. So we can put together some kind of list of recommended works.
Yeah. So if you have, go
Valerie,
ahead.
Can I
Yes,
offer
please.
one other thing is that while it's beneficial to read the kinds of books that have been named. That's one part. And I would encourage folks to also read, since we're kind of in a theological and ministerial context, to also read books that are not focused on this is the experience. So for example, I taught a course on leadership, and used one of the texts was a womanist leadership text. Some of the people who communicated the most appreciation were white, male, rural pastors, because for two things. One is some of them had not grown up with the kind of privilege that is so often assumed beneath the assertions of some of the texts that we read that are more male, middle class. And so there were lessons that some folks who grew up in Southern white poverty heard out of the Black womanist authors. So they weren't talking about the experience of racism explicitly. They were talking about leading out of a social location. And so there were people who learned because they heard voices coming from a different place. And one of the texts we used, it had a collection of Asian writers. They talked about the diversity within Asian communities.
You got muted.
I'm sorry,
Within Asian communities,
okay,
we're
within the
talking
Asian
about the diversity.
in the United States, which was an awakening because they did not know about the almost 36 Asian heritage identities in the United States. And so to hear Asian authors talk about the diversity within Asian identity was awakening as well. So we do need to read texts about the challenges, but also read texts from locations because we will hear what we had never heard before.
Thank you for that really helpful addition. I was going to suggest that it is useful always to have a reading list, but also we don't want to only have a reading list. And I was reminded of an earlier comment that David made in our conversation tonight about how we have interior work to do with ourselves within our own groups, however we identify those groups, whether it's, you know, your racial identity or your gender identity or your educational identity or whatever it is. We have places that we need to do our own interior work. And then as Jung has said several times, we also need to come together and do this collaborative work. And so it's a both and. We need to be engaged in the processes of both. And so I appreciate all the richness that you have brought to this conversation, the resources that you have brought from your own experience. We, as usual, have many more questions and comments than we actually have time for. So what I will say to the group that is gathered, if you have titles that you would like to share, I've been taking notes on particular things that have been said, and we will create a bit of a suggested reading list. But I also want to say that someone did ask a question earlier that I saw in the chat, asking for kind of a template or a checklist of a way to do reconciliation work. And my reaction immediately was that that's both a frequent question and also, for me personally, speaking from my perspective, it's almost too easy. So I want us both to be learning and reading and engaging with each other. And I also want to put the note of caution that conflict and places of pain and wounding are not the kinds of things where we have a cookie cutter approach or a one size fits all template. And the best advice that I have for people who want to work at this is to get involved in the mess and to make mistakes and to try and to be your honest, authentic self and to be willing to be vulnerable enough to and courageous enough to be confronted and to be willing to get it wrong sometimes. So do any of you panelists have any other encouraging word or response to that kind of a question or what I just said about it in our final minutes? And then I am going to conclude us with a word of prayer and a blessing.
I'll be real quick. sometimes when I hear my white siblings say that, I say, go join a Latinx organization, go join an AAPI organization, go join a Black organization or a church. Put yourself there as a learner, and don't ask for special favors or access to the leaders. Go join it. And I hear people lament about churches that are segregated. Leave your segregated church and go join another one. And I mean, it's easy, they'll take you. And subject yourself or make yourself available to be taught and to listen and to learn. So when I hear that from my white siblings, my response is, go join something where you're not in the majority, and be patient and be humble and be authentic and listen and learn. That will help you on the way to being an agent of reconciliation.
I mean, I agree with that. The work of reconciliation is relational. And as you were saying, Valerie, there are things, so many things that we cannot learn just by following a template or reading books. We need to do the work of getting out of our comfort zone. And as Dr. Goatley was saying, putting ourselves out there with the people that we don't know well and be good listeners. We shouldn't go there just to judge or think that we understand everything. Go with a humble, being humble and ready to learn and listen.
Definitely agreeing with the need to learn and to be out of our comfort zone. I always love the text in Acts 10 when the Peter see the vision coming from the heaven, the unclean animals, which was very wonderful ways of teaching Peter that God is putting Peter and his people out of comfort zone, but God's vision is for the wider vista than he ever thought about. So I'm thinking about that we are constantly pulled by God and God's people to be out of our comfort zone, to learn other people, how we all in different ways, but also connected ways, learn to love God and be inspired by God's Spirit. So.
Well, I want to extend my thanks sincerely again to the three of you for joining me in this conversation tonight, for being able to not gloss over, to really address and surface some of the conversation, some of the points of pain, some of the steps that we need to take collectively as a divinity school if we want to move in the direction of reconciliation. And I am so grateful to have colleagues in other places that are interested in collaborating with us and working on this movement towards justice and reconciliation and transformation and healing and wholeness. So thank you for your time. I'm going to close us this evening with just a brief poem. I've been reading recently, speaking of books, a book I found recently. It's called How to Love the World, Poems of Gratitude and Hope. And part of why I got this book is because I heard that Amanda Gorman, who some of you may recognize her name, so beautifully and eloquently provided a poem at our most recent US inauguration. So she has a poem published in this book. So that's part of why I picked it up. I'm not reading her poem this evening. I'm going to read a poem by Mark Nepo, or Nepo. I don't honestly know how to say the name. It's called In Love with the World. There is no end to love We may tear ourselves away or fall off the cliff we thought sacred, or return one day to find the home we dreamt of burning. But when the rain slows to a slant and the pavement turns cold, that place where I keep you and all of you, that place opens like a fist no longer strong enough to stay closed, and the ache returns. Thank God. The sweet and sudden ache that lets me know I am alive. The rain keeps misting my face. What majesty of cells assembles around this luminous presence that moves around as me? How is it I'm still here? Each thing touched, each breath, each glint of light, each pain in my gut is cause for praise. I pray to keep falling in love with everyone I meet, with every child's eye, with every fallen being getting up. Like a worm cut in two, the heart only grows another heart. When that cut in my mind heals, I grow another mind. Birds migrate and caribou circle the cold top of the world. Perhaps we migrate between love and suffering, making our wounded joyous cries, alone, then together, alone, then together. Oh, praise the soul's migration. I fall, I get up, I run from you, I look for you. I am again in love with the world. And I bring you this because we serve a beautiful, abundantly loving God and Creator who loves each of us more than we can ask or imagine, more than our words can tell. And He has created each of us in His own image. And so how much more should we be called into loving one another and growing together? I think, Jung, you even started with saying we needed a theology of love at some point. Thank you all for your time. We do face challenges. It is hard and long and messy work, but I appreciate being in the work together with all of you. Let's join together in a word of prayer. Transforming God, you come to us in expected and unexpected ways, desiring to be known, yet remaining a mystery. Make your presence known among us. Confront us, wrestle with us, change us through Jesus Christ our Lord. Thank you for the challenges you give us and the restlessness you place within us to shape this world and to transform it from what it is now into what it could be or should be. Thank you for faithful companions on the journey who hold us accountable and also extend grace to us when we fall short. Draw us to yourself in love, surround us with your grace, and keep us in the shelter of your wings so that we may bravely lean into and serve the calling you have placed on us. And in doing so, point to your hidden glory through Jesus Christ. Amen. Thank you all. Go now in peace. Our next session for the Summer Institute is tomorrow morning, Eastern Time in North Carolina at 11 a.m. And we will be speaking about the theology of lament.